Hello friends. Today I will tell you one of the most extraordinary stories in aviation history. On July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143, a Boeing 767, ran out of fuel at 41,000 feet, and its pilots made an extraordinary decision. They would try to land the plane using it as a giant glider on an abandoned military base. This is a dramatic story combining human error, technological failures, and the incredible skill of the pilots. We will examine this incident, known as the Gimli Glider, in full detail. Before the incident, a chain of critical errors. On the morning of July 23, 1983, it was a routine day in Montreal. Air Canada Flight 143 was waiting for its passengers to board for a flight to Edmonton. The Boeing 767-200 was the most modern aircraft in Air Canada's fleet at the time. In the cockpit were two experienced pilots, Captain Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal. At this point, the first critical error appeared. The aircraft's fuel quantity indication system was malfunctioning. Under normal circumstances, this would mean the flight would be cancelled. However, Air Canada's maintenance team reported that the fuel quantity could be calculated manually, and the flight could proceed safely. This is where the real disaster began. The Boeing 767 was the first aircraft in Air Canada's fleet to use the metric system. Fuel calculations were made in kilograms. However, there was a critical misunderstanding between the ground technicians and the cockpit crew. They calculated that the aircraft had 22,300 units of fuel in the tanks. But that amount was in pounds. In the metric system, this equals about 10,100 kilograms of fuel, less than half the required amount. This error didn't stand alone. Since the fuel gauge system was inoperative, the pilots had no way to monitor fuel levels during flight. They had to rely entirely on the initial incorrect calculations. The flight begins, a deceptive calm. At 7:20 p.m., Flight 143 took off from Montreal. There were 61 passengers and 8 crew members on board. The first hour went completely normally. The passengers were relaxed, and the crew carried out routine duties. No one realized the disaster approaching. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal were seasoned aviators. Pearson had a special skill. He held a glider pilot license. This detail would save 69 lives in the hours to come. The aircraft was cruising calmly westward over the province of Ontario. With the fuel gauges not working, the pilots were unaware of the seriousness of the situation. But with every passing minute, the fuel tanks were draining and the plane was heading toward disaster. Warning bells. The truth revealed. At around 8:20 p.m. over Red Lake, Ontario, the first alarm sounded in the cockpit, a low fuel pressure warning for the left engine. At first, the pilots assumed it was a fuel pump malfunction. It seemed routine. But as minutes passed, more alarms sounded. The fuel pressure low alert was constant. Soon, similar warnings came from the right engine. Pearson and Quintal began reviewing emergency procedures. The truth was far worse. The plane had truly run out of fuel. The tanks were empty, and the engines would soon stop working. At 8:26 p.m., the left engine failed. The familiar engine sound suddenly vanished. The cockpit fell silent. Minutes later, the right engine failed too. Flight 143 began gliding in total silence at 41,000 feet. This was one of the most dramatic moments in aviation history. An aircraft carrying 69 people was gliding without engines. Exit outflight. Glider mode. When the engines failed, the plane didn't immediately fall. The Boeing 767's aerodynamic design allowed it to glide like a sailplane, but it was descending at about 2,500 feet per minute. From 41,000 feet, The pilots had only about 15-20 minutes. Captain Pearson immediately declared an emergency. "Mayday, Mayday! Air Canada 143, fuel exhaustion, both engines out. Immediate clearance to nearest airport." Air traffic control was shocked. Fuel exhaustion in a twin-gene airliner was almost unheard of at that time. The first option was Winnipeg Airport, but it was too far. Thompson Airport was also out of reach. Then, First Officer Quintal remembered a key detail: the former Royal Canadian Air Force Base at Gimli. "Bob, we could go to Gimli," said Quintal. "An old military base, runways in good shape." The Gimli decision, last hope. Captain Pearson quickly calculated. Considering the descent rate and wind conditions, reaching Gimli seemed mathematically possible, but just barely. Pearson's glider experience now became vital. A glider has no engine power. It flies solely using wind and aerodynamics. Pearson began flying the Boeing 767 as a giant glider. But the problems didn't stop there. When the engines died, so did many electrical systems. Numerous cockpit instruments failed. GPS didn't exist yet. They had to navigate visually. As they approached Gimli, a new problem emerged. The old military base was no longer in active use, but was being used for other purposes. Car races were held on the runway during weekends, and at that exact time, there was activity on the strip. Landing approach. Final sequence. At 8:38 p.m., Flight 143 appeared over Gimli. The approach angle was steep, and the speed was very high. It was far too fast for a normal landing, and there was no engine power to slow down. Captain Pearson decided to perform a glider technique called a side slip. By turning the nose sideways, he could increase drag and reduce speed. This maneuver is extremely risky for a commercial jet. The plane approached the runway at 200 knots. Normal landing speed is around 140-160 knots. Passengers noticed the aircraft shaking. The crew told them to assume the emergency position. The car racers on the runway panicked. Upon seeing the approaching aircraft, they began evacuating the strip. The miraculous landing. At 8:38 and 20 seconds p.m., the wheels of Flight 143 touched down on Gimli's runway. The landing was hard and fast. Pearson tried to use all braking systems, but many hydraulic systems were offline. During landing, the nose landing gear collapsed. Normally, this would be disastrous, but in this case, it helped. The nose hitting the ground created extra friction. The aircraft sparked along the runway as it slowed. 17 seconds later, the plane came to a complete stop. No one had died. Only a few of the 69 people on board suffered minor injuries. This became one of the greatest miracles in aviation history. Evacuation and first moments. As soon as the plane stopped, the emergency evacuation began. The crew guided the passengers out through the exits. Most were in shock, but on their feet. Pearson Quintal shut down all systems and secured the aircraft. With no fuel left, the fire risk was minimal. Local fire crews arrived, but they were unprepared for such an event. Thankfully, a massive rescue operation was unnecessary. Passengers gathered at the side of the runway. They began to realize the magnitude of what they had just survived. They had glided from 41,000 feet and survived. Root causes revealed. The investigation later uncovered the main causes of the error chain. Primary cause, fuel calculation error. During Air Canada's transition to the metric system, a conversion error occurred. 22,300 pounds of fuel was miscalculated as 22,300 kilograms. The actual fuel on board was about half of what was required. Secondary cause, fuel gauge malfunction. If the system had worked, pilots could have monitored the fuel status in real time and detected the issue earlier. Contributing factors: communication failures, procedural errors, inadequate metric system training, technical analysis, glider performance. Engineers analyzed the aircraft's glide performance. The Boeing 767 achieved a 17:1 glide ratio. It descended 1 meter for every 17 meters it moved forward. Very good for such a large plane. Pearson's side-slip maneuver was technically flawless. It increased drag to reduce speed, though it carried a high risk of losing control. And the landing speed was 40% above normal. The nose gear collapse actually helped by adding braking force. Impact on the aviation industry. The Gimli Glider incident led to major changes in aviation. Fuel calculation systems. Double-check procedures were added for metric imperial conversions. Fuel gauge systems. Backup systems were developed to replace failed main systems. Pilot training. Fuel exhaustion. Scenarios became more common in simulator training. Alternative airports. The flight dispatchers began to plan for alternate airports along the entire route. The recovery of the aircraft. Recovering the 132-ton Boeing 767 from Gimli was a new engineering challenge. Engineers from Boeing and Air Canada created a special recovery plan. First, the nose was lifted and a temporary landing gear was installed. After 2 weeks of work, the aircraft took off from Gimli on August 24, 1983, and flew to Winnipeg. The repairs took several months. The nose was completely replaced and all systems were reviewed. The plane returned to service in May 1984. Afterlives. Captain Bob Pearson became an aviation legend. He received many awards and gave lectures. He continued working for Air Canada until his retirement in 1995. First Officer Maurice Quintal became a captain. His role in remembering Gimli became a case study in aviation training. Most passengers returned to their normal lives. Some wrote about their experiences and gave media interviews. In popular culture, the Gimli Glider story took a notable place in popular culture. In 1989, the TV movie Falling from the Sky, Flight 174, was released. Documentaries aired on Discovery Channel and National Geographic. Models are displayed in aviation museums. Featured in air crash investigation programs. Comparison with similar incidents. The closest comparison is the 2009 Miracle on the Hudson, when Captain Sully landed a plane on the Hudson River. Both incidents showed how pilot calmness and skill saved lives. But Gimli Glider was more dramatic because it glided longer, 17 minutes. Started from a higher altitude, 41,000 feet. Landed on land, caused by fuel exhaustion. Gimli today. The Gimli Air Base is now a tourist attraction. The Gimli Glider story is told there. A monument at the runway marks the event. Some passengers have returned years later to visit the site. Lasting impact on Asia's safety. This incident played a crucial role in shaping modern aviation safety. System redundancy. Critical systems now always have backups. Human factors. Human error is now a core consideration in system design. Cross-check procedures. Important calculations must be verified by multiple personnel. Training standards, emergency training scenarios have been expanded and congruent. The Gimli Glider is one of the most extraordinary stories in aviation history. A series of unfortunate events nearly caused disaster, but with pilot skill and a bit of luck, 69 people survived. This incident teaches us trusting technology is not enough. The human factor is critical. Staying calm in a crisis and making the right decisions can save lives. Teamwork is the most important factor in critical situations. Learning from mistakes prevents future tragedies. Thanks to Captain Pearson's glider experience, First Officer Quintal's memory of Gimli, and their perfect teamwork, this story turned into a miracle instead of a tragedy. The Gimli Glider forever changed aviation's safety culture and showed what pilots are capable of in extraordinary situations. It is one of the greatest examples of what the human spirit and professional skill can achieve. Finally, this event reminds us that despite all technological advancements, the human factor remains crucial in aviation. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal were not just skilled pilots, they were heroes. This incredible story that saved 69 lives will forever hold a place in aviation history.